Hello everyone, welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I never considered myself superstitious. I was the kind of person who looked for logical explanations. If a door creaked in the middle of the night, I blamed air pressure. If the power flickered, I assumed faulty wiring. Ghost stories were just that, stories, told by people who wanted to believe the world was more mysterious than it actually was. But after everything that happened with the gate, I don't know what to believe anymore. It started on a Wednesday night. I was sitting in my living room, the TV low, half watching some old rerun while scrolling through my phone. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes late at night when the world outside slows down. Then I heard it. A loud slam. The sound jolted me upright. It wasn't inside the house, no doors had moved, no windows had rattled. The noise had come from outside. I moved to the front window and peered through the blinds. My small front yard was empty, bathed in the weak glow of the streetlight down the block. But then my eyes moved to the gate. It was wide open. The latch, which should have held it shut, dangled loosely against the wooden post. My stomach twisted. I hadn't gone outside in hours, and I was sure, absolutely sure, that the gate had been closed. More than that, the latch was solid. It wasn't one of those flimsy hooks that might jiggle loose. It was a proper metal latch, one that required force to lift and swing open. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly earlier. Maybe some kid had come through and left it open. I stepped outside, shivering slightly as the night air pressed against my skin. The gate swung lazily in the breeze, the hinges letting out a faint creak. I reached for the latch and tested it. It didn't feel loose. I lifted it, swung the gate open, then let it fall shut again. It latched securely. There was no wind, no reason it should have moved. Still, I chalked it up to a fluke and went back inside. The next morning, I examined the latch more closely. It was old but sturdy, screwed tightly into the post. If anything, it seemed too secure to open on its own. Just to be safe, I tightened the screws and gave it a final test. It held. For a few days, nothing happened. Then Saturday night, 2 a.m., it happened again. This time I wasn't watching TV. I had just turned off my bedside lamp, settling into that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep, when a crash echoed from outside. Not just a swing this time. A full-force kick. I shot upright, heart hammering. For a long moment I just sat there listening, waiting for footsteps or voices. But the night was silent. Slowly I got up, crept to the window, and peeked through the blinds. The gate was open. Again. I hesitated. The rational part of me said I should go outside, check for footprints, see if someone had been messing with it. But another part of me, the part that had woken up in a cold sweat from that noise, told me to wait until morning. The next day, I replaced the latch completely, a brand new metal lock, one that required a firm lift and push to open. There was no way it would come loose on its own. That night, I slept soundly. But the night after, the gate opened again. And this time, I knew for sure it wasn't the wind. The next morning I stood by the gate, staring at it like it might move on its own in broad daylight. The new latch was still attached, perfectly intact. There were no scuff marks on the wood, no signs of forced entry. The screws I had tightened the day before hadn't budged, and yet at some point during the night it had opened. I tested it over and over, swinging it shut, latching it, yanking at it from different angles. It held firm. I tried nudging it, gently, seeing if maybe it hadn't latched properly before. Nothing. I even kicked it lightly to see if a strong gust of wind could force it open. It didn't budge, so how had it opened? By noon, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I had spent too much time thinking about it, turning a simple latch problem into something bigger than it was. Maybe I had misremembered locking it. Maybe I had been half asleep the night before and imagined hearing it slam. That night I locked it again and told myself not to think about it. I tried. I really did. But by 2:34 a.m. I was wide awake. I hadn't heard the gate move, I hadn't heard anything, and that was the problem. The silence was unnatural, stretching too long, too deep, like the house and the yard were holding their breath. I reached for my phone, turning on the screen, just to break the stillness. 2:34. Then, a click. Not the loud slam from before, not the impact of something kicking it open, just a quiet, deliberate click. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, barely breathing. The blinds were drawn, but I could see a faint shadow of movement outside. Something shifting just beyond the glass, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight. I should have stayed in bed. I should have ignored it. But I didn't. I slid out from under the covers, moving as quietly as possible. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I reached for the blinds and pulled them apart just enough to see. The gate was wide open. A shiver ran through me. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was an animal, a person. But even before I stepped closer, I knew neither of those explanations fit. Because the latch, the brand new reinforced latch, was dangling open, and the bolt had been placed neatly on the ground beside the gate. Not thrown, not forced, set down. I stood there for a long time, barely blinking, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The gate swayed slightly, moving only with the night air. The streetlight flickered once. Then silence. I didn't go outside. I didn't even unlock the door. Instead, I picked up my phone and ordered a motion-activated security camera. Because if this was going to keep happening, I needed to see what was opening that gate. The security camera arrived the next afternoon. I spent an hour setting it up, mounting it on the porch with a clear view of the gate. The device was simple, motion-activated, with night vision and a direct feed to my phone. If anything moved outside, I'd see it. No more guessing, no more wondering. That night, I locked the gate as securely as possible. I double-checked the latch, tested the strength of the new bolt. Just to be sure, I tied a thick rope around the gate post, pulling it tight with a knot that would take real effort to undo. When I finally went inside, I felt more in control. It wasn't paranoia if I was being practical. By midnight, I was in bed, phone on the nightstand, waiting for an alert. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 2:07 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. My stomach twisted as I grabbed it, pulling up the live feed. The screen flickered, and then there it was. The gate was moving. Not swinging gently. Moving. The latch lifted on its own, slow and deliberate. Then the bolt, the heavy bolt I had driven into place just hours ago, was removed piece by piece, as if someone with careful hands was dismantling it. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the rope untied itself. Not snapped, not frayed, untied. The loop came undone in one smooth motion, the end of the rope slipping free like someone had calmly unwrapped it. And then the gate swung open. A chill crawled up my spine. My pulse pounded against my ribs as I stared at the screen, watching the empty yard beyond the open gate. Nothing moved. No people, no animals. Nothing. But something had just undone 3 separate locks. I sat frozen, my grip tightening around the phone. I wanted to tell myself it was a glitch, that the camera had malfunctioned, that the wind had somehow lifted the latch, removed the bolt, untied the rope, but I knew better. I forced myself out of bed, heart hammering, and crept to the window. The gate was wide open, just like the video showed. The rope lay neatly in, a coil on the ground beside it. I backed away, my breathing unsteady. I had proof now. Something was out there. Something that didn't just force its way through, it knew how to open locks. I barely slept after that. Every sound, every shift of the house made my skin crawl. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside with shaky legs, checking the yard for any sign of footprints, disturbed dirt, anything. There was nothing. No evidence. No trail leading to or from the gate. Just the bolt, the rope, and the gate standing wide open like an invitation. I called my friend Mark that afternoon. "I need you to stay over," I said. He didn't ask why. He could hear the fear in my voice. Neither of us slept. Mark sat stiff on the couch, gripping the baseball bat like he actually planned to use it. I stayed in the armchair, phone in my lap, staring at the black screen where the camera feed had cut out. Every so often, one of us would glance toward the window, but neither of us spoke. Outside, the gate stood wide open. The night stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I kept expecting something else to happen. A sound, a shadow moving past the window, a flicker of something in the corner of my eye. But nothing came. The silence itself felt unnatural, like the house and everything around it was waiting. By the time the sky turned gray with the first light of morning, I felt like I had been drained of everything. I stood slowly, my legs aching, and peeled back the blinds just enough to see. The street was empty. The gate was still open. The bolt and rope still lay neatly on the ground. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone. Mark exhaled and rubbed his face. So, what now? I didn't have an answer. I stepped outside, forcing my legs to move even though every instinct told me not to. The air was thick with morning dampness, the smell of dew clinging to the overgrown grass. The wind had finally returned, rustling through the trees. Everything looked normal. But it wasn't. The ground near the gate was untouched. No footprints, no drag marks, no sign that anything had been standing there hours before. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I bent down, picking up the bolt. It was cold, slightly damp from the night air. The rope lay curled neatly, the knot I had tied completely undone. Mark hovered by the porch, watching me. "You're not actually staying here, right?" I didn't answer right away. I looked back at the house, the windows catching the dull morning, light reflecting nothing but the sky. I thought about what I had seen, the latch lifting, the bolt sliding out, the rope coming untied all on its own, and the shape. The impossible, still watching shape just beyond the glow of the streetlight. I tightened my grip on the bolt and finally said, "No, I'm done." By that afternoon, I had packed everything I cared about. I left behind the furniture, the dishes, anything that didn't fit in my car. Mark didn't let me leave alone. He followed in his own car, making sure I actually drove away. I didn't look back. A few days later, I got a call from my landlord. He asked why I had left so suddenly, why I had broken my lease without warning. He sounded annoyed more than anything. Then he sighed and said, "Let me guess. It was the gate, wasn't it?" My skin went cold. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, people don't usually last long there. Thought maybe you'd be different." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I hung up the phone and blocked the number. I never went back. And I never found out what was opening the gate. I never paid much attention to my apartment hallway. It was the kind of place you pass through without thinking. A narrow stretch of beige carpet, flickering overhead lights, and doors that all looked the same. There was nothing remarkable about it. Nothing that ever made me feel unsafe. That changed the night I saw the shadow. It was 11:13 p.m. the first time it happened. I remember the time exactly because I had just checked my phone before getting up to grab a glass of water. I was halfway to the kitchen when something outside my door caught my eye. A shape standing just beyond the peephole. I froze. The hallway. Light was dim, the yellowish glow barely illuminating the space beneath my door. But I could see it. A shadow. A figure standing still, just feet from my apartment. I waited, breath shallow. No knock, no movement, just standing. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet to move toward the door. My heart thumped as I leaned forward, pressing my eye against the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. I didn't want to open the door, but my brain needed proof. Had I really seen someone? Or was I just imagining things? I exhaled sharply, twisted the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. The hallway stretched in both directions, completely still. The air felt stale, slightly colder than it should have been. I stepped out just enough to glance around. No movement, no sound, no one. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I had caught a glimpse of my own shadow at the wrong angle. Or maybe someone had been walking by and I had just missed them. Either way, I locked the door and went back to bed, convincing myself it was nothing. The next night, it happened again. 11:13 p.m. I had been on my couch half watching some show when a familiar feeling made my skin prickle. I turned my head toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow was back. Same spot, same shape. But this time the hallway light was off. There was no reason I should have been able to see anything at all. And yet, there it was. Darker than the unlit hallway itself. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and opened the camera. My fingers fumbled over the record button as I lifted it toward the peephole. The screen showed only grainy darkness. But then, for a fraction of a second, something flickered. A shape. Blurry, shifting, just out of focus. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I opened the door immediately. The hallway was empty. Again. But this time, when I stepped out, the air was different. Colder. And as I stood there, scanning the dimly lit corridor, I had the unmistakable feeling that something was still there. Watching. I didn't sleep that night. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion. Maybe some trick of the dim lighting, but my body wasn't convinced. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape again. That dark, shifting outline standing just outside my door. By morning, I felt, drained. My nerves frayed from replaying the incident in my head. I kept checking my phone, staring at the grainy footage I'd recorded. It didn't show much, just a few seconds of my peephole view, the hallway dark and silent. But if I watched closely, really closely, there was something off. For a brief moment, the screen glitched. Not a normal, shaky hand kind of blur, but a digital distortion, a warping effect, like something had interrupted the feed. I told myself it was just the camera struggling in low light. But part of me wasn't so sure. By evening, my anxiety had shifted into something else. Curiosity. I had always been the type to rationalize things, to find an explanation for the unexplainable. Maybe if I confronted it, I could prove it was nothing, or maybe I just wanted to know if it would come back. That night, at exactly 11:10 p.m., I turned off all the lights in my apartment and sat in the dark, facing the door. My phone was ready, camera app open. I watched the minutes creep by, my heart pounding harder the closer it got to 11:13. Then it happened. The hallway light outside flickered, just once. And then, like clockwork, the shadow appeared. I sucked in a breath, forcing myself to stay still. It was just like before, tall, unmoving, darker than the hallway itself. I lifted my phone, trying to steady my hand as I hit record. The screen showed the same thing my eyes did, a dark figure standing just feet away. Then, without warning, it moved. Not a normal human-like step. A shift. A blur. A sudden jerk, like it had flickered closer. In an instant. The screen glitched again. I felt something in my chest tighten, a deep instinctive fear that I couldn't explain. I reached out with my free hand and flicked on the overhead light. The hallway was empty. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, and yanked open the door. Cold air hit me immediately. The kind of cold that doesn't belong indoors, that sinks into your skin like it has weight. I stepped out into the hallway. Nothing. The walls, the floor, the flickering overhead lights. Everything was exactly as it should be. But the air felt wrong. The quiet was too deep, too heavy. I stood there for a full minute, my breathing uneven. I wasn't sure what I had expected to find. Footprints, a lingering shadow, some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. Instead, I felt it. A presence. Something unseen just beyond the edge of my senses, watching, waiting. I backed up, my hands cold and clammy, and stepped inside my apartment. I locked the door, then I double-checked that it was locked. Then I sat on the couch staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. But the worst part? Nothing did. And somehow that made it even worse. The next day, I tried to carry on like normal. I went to work, ran errands, even stopped for coffee at the little cafe on the corner. I told myself that whatever happened the night before was just a trick of the light, my brain playing games with me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, that something was wrong. By the time I got home that evening, my stomach was already in knots. I stood outside my apartment door for a long moment before unlocking it, half expecting something to be waiting inside. But everything was just as I left it. The lights were off, my jacket still draped over the back of the couch, the faint hum of the fridge filling the silence. Still, the tension in my chest refused to ease. I found myself checking the locks, twice, then 3 times. At 11 p.m., I turned off all the lights again and sat on the couch, my phone resting in my palm. My eyes were locked on the door, waiting. By 11:10, my pulse had started to climb. By 11:12, my breathing had gone shallow. At 11:13, the hallway, light flickered. I gripped my phone, knuckles going white. A shadow slid into view. It was the same as before, tall, unmoving, standing just beyond my door. But this time it felt different. Heavier, more solid. Like it wasn't just an absence of light, but something real. I raised my phone, pressed record. The screen showed the same thing my eyes did, the dark shape standing motionless outside. But this time the image didn't just glitch, it warped. The entire frame twisted for a second, like something had reached inside the camera and pulled at the pixels. My stomach flipped, then the shape tilted its head. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A slow, deliberate shift, like it knew I was watching, like it was acknowledging me. A sharp sound broke through the silence, scraping. Not from the hallway, from inside my apartment. I spun around, heart hammering. The noise came again, low and deliberate, like nails dragging along wood. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it across the room. The sound stopped, but something was different. The closet door near my bathroom was open. I never leave. That door open. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My body was telling me to run, to get out, to do something, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. Then from the hallway, a knock. Not loud, not rushed. Just 3 slow, deliberate taps against my door. I turned back, breath caught in my throat. The shadow was gone. But I knew somehow that it hadn't left, it was waiting. I stood frozen, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it. The knock had been soft, deliberate. Not the kind of knock someone gives when they're delivering a package or visiting a neighbor. This was different. This was meant for me. I swallowed, hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. My phone was still recording, but I couldn't bring myself to check the screen. Instead, I forced myself to move just an inch, just enough to shift my weight and convince my body that I wasn't paralyzed with fear. Another knock, 3 taps. Slow, measured. I licked my lips, gripping my phone tighter. Hello? My voice barely came out. It sounded small, weak. The kind of voice you hear in a horror movie just before something goes wrong. No answer. I took a slow, unsteady breath and inched toward the peephole. My hands were slick with sweat, the phone in my grip feeling slippery. I hesitated just before pressing my eye against the tiny glass circle. The hallway was empty. No shadow, no movement. Just the same flickering light, the same stretch of beige carpet. But I knew better than to believe what I was seeing. Something had been there. And worse, something had knocked. I stepped back, heart still hammering against my ribs. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Something that didn't involve ghosts or whatever the hell this was. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe this was all a setup, a prank, some kind of elaborate trick. But then I remembered the scraping sound from inside my apartment. Slowly, I turned my head back toward the open closet door. The air in the room felt heavier, like I was standing at the bottom of a deep well. The closet door was open just enough to see inside. Darkness, stretching beyond what should have been a shallow space. My breath hitched. I took a step closer. Then another. My hand shook as I reached for the closet light. My fingertips brushed the switch. Click. The overhead light flickered on, casting a dull yellow glow over the small space. It was empty. No coats pushed aside, no boxes disturbed, nothing hiding in the corner. But the feeling remained. That thick, pressing weight in the air. That gnawing sense that if I reached just a little further, my fingers might brush against something I couldn't see. I stepped back, my chest tight, and turned off the light. Then I grabbed the closet door and shoved it shut. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I locked it. The scraping didn't come back, but neither did sleep. I stayed up for the rest of the night, sitting in the armchair by the door with every light in my apartment on. Every few minutes I checked the peephole. Every time the hallway was still. By the time morning finally came, I felt like I had aged 10 years. And the worst part? I knew it wasn't over. I wasn't running away when I moved to the lake house. At least that's what I told myself. I had spent most of my life in the city, surrounded by constant noise. Honking cars, sirens wailing in the distance, the low murmur of strangers passing on the street. It was easy to drown in it, to disappear into the hum of everyday life. But after everything that had happened, after the stress, the late nights, the feeling of being crushed under the weight of my own exhaustion, I needed space. I needed quiet. The lake house belonged to an old family friend, someone my father had known before I was born. It was a simple, one-story cabin tucked away in the woods, overlooking a deep, still lake, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard, with a small dock stretching over the water and pine trees lining the shore. The nearest town was a half-hour drive, and there were no neighbors in sight. Perfect. I had arrived in early spring, the air still crisp with the last remnants of winter. The first few days were peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on the porch, watching the mist rise from the lake. I took long walks through the woods, breathing in the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I told myself I had made the right choice. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing things. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little details that felt off. The forest was dense, the trees stretching high above, their branches tangled together in a way that let in only slivers of sunlight. But sometimes when I walked along the trails, I would get the distinct feeling that something had moved just out of sight. At night, the woods were silent. Too silent. I had expected the usual sounds, owls, crickets, the occasional rustling of small animals. Instead, I was met with stillness, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then came the noises. The first time I heard it, I was sitting on the porch just after sunset, sipping a beer. A sudden snap of a branch echoed from the tree line. Not the casual break of something falling naturally. This was sharp, deliberate, like footsteps. I set my beer down and listened. Another snap, then another. The sounds circled the property, slow and deliberate, as if something was moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees, expecting to see a deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, that the woods had their own rhythm, their own way of making sounds that felt like something more. But the next morning, I found them. Curved lines of branches arranged in strange, twisting patterns near the edge of the lake. They almost looked like footprints. I crouched near the patterns, brushing my fingers over the curved branches. They weren't scattered randomly like fallen debris. They had been placed, deliberately arranged into twisting shapes that almost resembled footprints. only too large, too unnatural. The arcs of wood curved in ways that didn't make sense, as if something with an impossible gait had stepped there. I stood up slowly, glancing around the lake's edge. The morning mist curled over the surface of the water, drifting like a living thing. The trees on the opposite bank stood still, their dark trunks mirrored in the lake's glassy surface. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I told myself it was nothing. The woods had a way of creating strange patterns, branches falling just the right way, wind pushing things into unnatural shapes. But as I turned to head back to the house, I noticed something else. The ground beneath the branches was damp, the mud slightly depressed. Something had stepped there. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I busied myself with small tasks, splitting firewood, cleaning the kitchen, making a half-hearted attempt to read. But every so often I caught myself glancing toward the windows, scanning the tree line. By nightfall, the unease had settled deep in my chest. I kept the porch light on, something I hadn't done before. The bulb cast a pale glow over the front, steps barely reaching the first few feet of the yard before dissolving into darkness. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard it again, a sharp snap from outside. I froze, listening. Another crack, closer this time. I shut off the faucet, the house suddenly too silent around me. My pulse thudded in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, walked to the back door, and slowly pushed it open. The air was cold against my face, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I stepped onto the porch, my bare feet pressing against the wooden planks, and swept the flashlight beam across the yard. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the lake, something moved, a tall shape half hidden by the trees. I barely caught a glimpse, something covered in moss and dark, wet algae. The beam of my flashlight flickered against the outline of limbs, a torso, something impossibly thin and too long. Then it was gone. A sound rose from the woods, low and drawn out, something between a howl and a groan. It echoed across the water, reverberating through the trees like a call. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I stayed up for hours after that, every light in the house burning, listening to the wind press against the windows. The howl never came again. But in the morning, I found more of the twisted footprints. And this time, they led straight into the woods. I stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the strange impressions in the dirt. They were larger than the ones by the lake, more defined now that the morning light slanted through the trees. The curved branches had been placed deliberately again, arching in a way that mimicked a gait, but whatever had left them had a stride too long for any normal person. The ovals pressed into the soft ground looked almost human, but not quite. Something had walked through here. I knelt down, running my fingers over one of the indentations. The edges were damp, the soil still freshly disturbed. It had been recent, maybe even last night. I followed the tracks deeper into the trees, my heartbeat steady but fast. The forest was thick, the canopy swallowing most of the daylight. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The wind barely reached this far, and no birds called from the branches. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves under my boots. Then I noticed the flattened patches of grass. Something big had moved through here, brushing against the undergrowth, pressing through the brambles without hesitation. Small saplings were bent, their bark scraped raw, and here and there deep scratches had been carved into tree trunks. I reached out to one of the marks, running my palm over the rough wood. The grooves were wide, deeper than anything a person could make with a knife. A sound crackled through the trees behind me, a sharp, deliberate clicking. I turned too fast, nearly tripping over my own feet. The sound came again, closer this time, like two stones being knocked together in a slow, rhythmic pattern. My throat tightened. Click, click, click. I scanned the trees, flashlight in hand, even though the morning light still reached through the branches. I saw nothing. Just layers of shifting shadows, the tangled arms of the trees stretching in all directions. But I could feel something watching. I took a step back, careful not to make too much noise. My boot brushed against the leaves, and suddenly the clicking sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I turned and walked quickly back toward the house, forcing myself not to run. The trees closed in around me, the path somehow feeling narrower than before. My skin prickled with the unbearable sensation of eyes on me, something just beyond my line of sight. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the house, my lungs loosened, and I sucked in a shaky breath. I climbed the porch steps 2 at a time and slammed the door behind me, locking it out of instinct. Then I turned toward the window. There, just beyond the tree line, something moved. A tall shape, impossibly thin, shifting behind the cover of a tree. Its outline was barely visible, draped in moss and shadow. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that it had followed me back. I sat at the kitchen table, gripping the edge of the wood so hard my knuckles ached. My breath came shallow and fast as I stared at the window, my eyes locked on the trees. The shape was gone. Or maybe it was still there, just blending into the shadows, watching. I forced myself to think. The thing, whatever it was, had followed me. That meant it was aware of me, that it had some kind of intent. It wasn't just an animal wandering the woods, leaving strange tracks out of coincidence. It had walked around my house. It had left those clicking sounds in the forest. It had watched me. I stood up too fast, the chair legs scraping against the floor. My limbs felt stiff, my body unsure whether to run or hide. I needed to check the property. The motion sensor lights had flickered last night, but I had been too shaken to go outside and look. Now, with the weak morning light stretching across the lake, I forced myself onto the porch, my breath tight in my chest. The ground beneath the eaves of the house was damp from the night before. The dirt had been disturbed, small patches of mud churned up where something had stood just beyond the reach of the porch light. I followed the marks toward the back of the house, my steps cautious, my ears straining for any sound. Then I saw it, a smudged handprint on the kitchen window. I stopped cold. The print was faint, just an outline pressed against the glass, streaked, with dirt and something dark, almost green. It wasn't shaped right. The fingers too long, the palm too narrow. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering, and realized the smudge wasn't from a normal hand. It had too many joints. The shape of the fingers curved slightly in the middle, bending where no humans would, like something had pressed its hand flat against the window and dragged it downward. I stepped back, my breath shuddering. My mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation, something logical that could make this make sense. But there was nothing. I had been right. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. It had been here. The late afternoon passed in a blur. I kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn. Every sound outside sent a spike of cold fear through my ribs. I turned every light on as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the yellow glow of the bulbs fighting against the growing dark. A clicking sound returned after nightfall, soft at first like an echo, then louder, circling the house in slow, measured movements. I pressed my back against the living room wall, gripping the phone in my hands even though I didn't know who I would call. The lights outside flickered. Then, from the window, something darted behind a tree. Tall, thin, covered in moss and algae. It was closer now, and it wasn't leaving. I barely slept. The lights stayed on all night, humming softly, but they didn't make me feel any safer. Every time I started to drift off, the clicking sounds would start again. Slow, deliberate taps that circled the house like something testing the boundaries. The motion sensor lights flared to life twice, but I never worked up the courage to look outside. By dawn, my body felt like it had been wrung out. My hands shook as I made coffee, the rich, bitter smell doing nothing to settle my nerves. The house was silent now, the early morning light creeping in through the curtains. It would have been easy to convince myself that last night had just been a bad dream if it weren't for the handprint on the kitchen window and the new scratches on the trees. I found them when I finally forced myself outside, heart hammering, with every step. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the lake stretching out in the distance like a slab of glass. I moved cautiously along the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement. That's when I saw the marks, 3 deep, parallel scratches gouged into the bark of a pine tree just beyond the porch. The cuts were fresh, the raw wood beneath the surface still pale against the dark, weathered trunk. I turned slowly, scanning the other trees. More marks, some higher up, as if something tall had dragged its fingers along the wood while walking past. The realization sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. It had been moving through the trees, circling the house. Watching. I needed to leave. I turned back toward the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven. Inside, I grabbed my duffel bag, stuffing in clothes, my wallet, anything I could reach. My heart pounded against my ribs as I tossed my phone charger into the bag. Then I heard it. Not outside this time. Inside. A slow, deliberate tap against the floorboards down the hall. My breath hitched. I turned my head just slightly, barely daring to look. The bedroom door, which I had left wide open that morning, was now cracked just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another tap. The air in the house felt thick, pressing in around me, making it hard to think, hard to move. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. I forced myself to take a slow step back, then another. I needed to get out. The front door was only a few feet away now. My pulse roared in my ears as I reached for the handle, my fingers barely brushing the metal before click, click, click right behind me. I lunged forward, yanking the door open so hard it slammed against the wall. Cold air rushed in as I stumbled onto the porch, nearly tripping over the steps in my panic. I didn't stop. I ran straight for my car, my hands shaking so badly I fumbled with the keys twice before shoving one into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't dare look back as I tore out of the driveway, gravel spitting under the tires. The cabin shrank in the rearview mirror, the trees swallowing it whole. The clicking sounds faded, but the feeling of being watched never did. I left the lake house that day and never returned. A few weeks later, the owner called saying he had stopped by to check on the place. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. But he found something strange. A single curved branch left in the middle of the porch, like a footprint or a message. I don't know if it wanted me to stay or if it was warning me never to come back. I never believed in ghosts. I was raised in a house where everything had a logical explanation. Every creaking floorboard, every flickering light, every unexplained sound in the night. My mother would always say, "Old houses make noise. That's just how they are." And I believed her. Even when I heard the occasional knock on my bedroom wall at night. Even when my childhood dog refused to enter certain rooms. I never let myself consider the possibility of something else. That changed the night I moved into the attic room of the old guest house. The house itself was charming in an outdated way, the kind of place that had seen better days but still stood firm against time. The exterior was all dark wood and ivy-covered bricks, the windows large and uneven. It had been a guest house once back in the early 1900s, but now it was just a quiet rental run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Calloway. When I first arrived, she greeted me with a polite but distant demeanor, as if she had long since grown tired of strangers passing through. She led me up 2 flights of stairs to the attic room, a small but comfortable space with slanted ceilings and an old wooden dresser pushed against the far wall. There was only one window, round and warped from age, letting in a dim light that made the space feel smaller than it was. A single chair sat in the corner by the door, facing inward, as if someone had just been sitting there. Mrs. Calloway lingered for a moment, hands clasped in front of her. "This room is usually vacant," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" She hesitated before shrugging. "Some people find it uncomfortable." I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. Instead, she handed me the key and muttered, "Rent's due the 1st of the month," before making her way back downstairs, leaving me alone in my new home. At first, it felt normal enough. I unpacked my bags, set up my laptop on the desk by the window, and told myself that whatever Mrs. Calloway meant by uncomfortable was probably just the draftiness of an old attic. By midnight, the wind had picked up outside, making the old house groan with each gust. I lay in bed, staring up at the slanted ceiling, listening to the quiet. And then, footsteps. Faint, but distinct. Slow, deliberate. They weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside the room. I bolted upright, heart hammering. My eyes scanned the space, but there was nothing. Just the chair by the door, my scattered belongings, and the empty darkness pressing against the window. I told myself it was just the house settling. But then, out of the corner of my eye, the chair moved. Just a fraction of an inch. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. It had to be the exhaustion from the move, my mind playing tricks in the dim light. The chair hadn't really moved. I had probably bumped into it earlier without noticing. And the footsteps? Just the old wood shifting as the temperature changed. At least that's what I told myself. Mrs. Calloway barely acknowledged me when I came downstairs for coffee. She was sitting at the small kitchen table, reading an old newspaper, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. The kitchen smelled of lemon and something faintly metallic like old pipes. "Did you sleep all right?" she asked without looking up. I hesitated. Something about the way she asked made it seem like she already knew the answer. "It was fine," I lied. She hummed in response, flipping a page. I waited for her to say something else, to explain why the room made people uncomfortable, but she didn't. Instead, she took a slow sip of tea and turned her attention to the crossword puzzle folded beside her newspaper. I spent most of the day out wandering the town, trying to get a feel for the place. Savannah had always fascinated me with its moss-draped oaks and old-world charm, but this part of the city felt different. Quieter. The kind of quiet that makes you second-guess whether you're being watched. By the time I got back to the guest house, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the last traces of daylight fading. I climbed the stairs to the attic, telling myself that tonight would be different. It wasn't. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, as if the room had been holding its breath while I was gone. The chair by the door was slightly angled now, not in the position I had left it that morning. I frowned and nudged it back into place, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up my spine. As the hours passed, the house settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. The pipes moaned. The wind rattled against the eaves. Every now and then I could hear the faint shuffle of Mrs. Calloway moving around downstairs. Then, just past midnight, the noises started again. At first it was the same slow, measured footsteps, soft like someone walking on the balls of their feet. The sound moved across the room, stopping near the dresser. I held my breath, gripping the blanket in my hands. A long, scraping sound followed, wood against wood. The dresser had moved. I turned on my bedside lamp, the warm glow cutting through the darkness. Everything looked normal. The dresser was where it had always been. The chair was still facing the door. And yet something felt off. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, too low to make out the words, but close, near the foot of the bed. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, because in that moment I knew I wasn't alone. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening to the quiet stretch of the attic room. The whisper had been so faint, so brief, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. Maybe it had been the wind slipping through the cracks in the old walls, or the house shifting under its own weight. But something deep in my gut told me otherwise. The feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like a weighted blanket. My eyes darted to the chair by the door. It hadn't moved. The dresser stood exactly where it always had. Nothing looked out of place. And yet, something was wrong. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the small motion feeling like a risk, like whatever was in the room might react if I moved too suddenly. My hand trembled as I turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam over the wooden floor. Empty. I exhaled slowly, willing my heart to stop pounding. I wasn't going to let my mind play tricks on me. This was just another old house. Strange sounds, drafts, the way darkness could make familiar shapes seem unfamiliar. That's all it was. but I didn't turn off the flashlight. Instead, I left it on and aimed it at the ceiling, letting the soft glow fill the room as I lay back down. The whispers didn't return. The furniture stayed still. The air gradually lost its oppressive weight. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my nerves and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. By morning, the attic looked perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened. The rational part of me wanted to forget about last night, to brush it off and move forward. But another part of me, the part that had felt that whisper in my bones, wasn't so sure. I found Mrs. Calloway in the kitchen again, standing by the sink, staring out the small window above it. She didn't turn around when I entered. "You hear anything last night?" she asked, her voice calm, almost indifferent. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Just house noises," I said carefully. She let out a quiet hum, rinsing out her teacup. "That room's had its share of renters," she said after a pause. "Never seems to keep them for long." I waited for her to say more, to explain why, but she simply dried the cup with a faded dish towel and placed it on the counter. I swallowed hard. "Have you ever heard anything?" Mrs. Calloway turned then, her sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. "House makes noise," she said, the words flat, deliberate. "Always has." She held my gaze for a moment longer, then walked past me, leaving the conversation hanging in the air. I didn't ask again, but that night, when the attic filled with silence, I braced myself for whatever was coming next. I tried to convince myself that the attic room was just another place, that my exhaustion was making me paranoid. But as the sun set and the quiet of the house settled in, I felt the weight of something unseen pressing in again. I left the lamp on, the small pool of light casting soft, flickering shadows on the slanted ceiling. Every sound, the wind creaking against the eaves, the distant hum of the water heater kicking on downstairs, felt magnified, stretched into something unnatural. I told myself to breathe, to stop overanalyzing every noise. Then, around midnight, the floor creaked, not in the slow, aimless way of an old house shifting, but in a pattern, one deliberate step, then another, moving from the far end of the room toward my bed. I sat up so fast my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the bright beam cutting through the dimness. The chair was still facing the door. The dresser stood against the wall. Nothing had moved. But then I saw it. A faint impression in the dust near the foot of the bed. A scuff mark, like someone had shifted their weight mid-step. I swallowed. Hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I wasn't just imagining things. I got up, forcing myself to walk across the room, to push against the dresser, to nudge the chair. Both were solid, unmoving. The air around me felt charged, like the second before a lightning strike. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering, scanning every inch of the small attic space, and then I caught it just for a second. A figure reflected in the round attic window. A man, not fully solid, more like the impression of someone standing just behind me, his outline barely there against the dark glass. He wore an old coat, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. Nothing. The room was empty. I turned back to the window, but the reflection was gone. Only my own pale, wide-eyed face stared back at me. I forced myself to move, to do something other than stand there like a terrified idiot. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera, and hit record. If this was real, if something was really happening, I wanted proof. I stood in the center of the room, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone here?" The attic was silent. The air felt thick, pressing in on me. I asked again, "Did you used to live here?" Nothing. I let the recording run a little, longer, then stopped it and played it back. The first few seconds were just my voice, the crackling static of the microphone picking up the emptiness of the room. But then, just before I had stopped recording, there was something else. A low, breathy murmur, Not words, not quite, just the faintest sound of someone exhaling. Right next to me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, my back against the headboard, my phone clutched in my hand. I played the recording over and over, trying to convince myself that the sound at the end, the breath, the faint exhale, was just interference, a trick of the microphone. But deep down I knew better. By morning I felt hollowed out, my nerves stretched thin. Sunlight filtered weakly through the attic's round window, doing little to warm the space. The room still felt heavy, as if whatever had been there last night had only retreated into the corners, waiting. I took my phone downstairs and found Mrs. Calloway in the kitchen, exactly as she had been the morning before, stirring a spoon through a cup of tea. She glanced up when I walked in, her eyes lingering on the dark circles under mine. "Didn't sleep well," she said. It wasn't a question. I hesitated, then slid my phone across the table. I recorded something. She stared at it for a long moment before finally pressing play. The room filled with the sound of my own hesitant voice, the stillness of the attic captured in grainy audio. And then, just before the recording ended, the breath. The sound was unmistakable. Mrs. Calloway's expression didn't change, but I saw the way her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her spoon. She let the recording play to the end, then handed the phone back to me. "Old houses make noise," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something careful and measured. I exhaled sharply. "That's not the house." She didn't answer right away. She reached for her tea, took a slow sip, and then, without looking at me, said, "The attic used to be a servant's quarters." I blinked. "What?" She set the cup down gently, her gaze fixed on the window. "A long time ago, before it was a guest house. The man who lived up there worked for the family that owned this house. He died in that room." The words sent a cold shiver through me. "How?" Mrs. Calloway hesitated. "Nobody knows for sure." I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. She just picked up her crossword puzzle and started filling in letters as if the conversation had already ended. I wanted to press her, to demand answers, but something about the way she carried herself made it clear that this was all she was willing to say. I went back upstairs, the attic suddenly feeling smaller, the walls pressing in. I stood in the center of the room, staring at the chair by the door, at the dresser that had moved in the night. I thought about the reflection I had seen in the window. I wasn't scared anymore. I was tired. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I packed my bags. I left the key on the nightstand, the way I had found it when I first arrived. Before I turned to go, I paused in the doorway, glancing once more at the chair. It was facing the bed now. I shut the door behind me and never looked back. I never paid much attention to the attic when I first moved into this house. It was just another storage space, a dusty, forgotten place filled with old boxes, antique furniture, and the kind of relics families hold on to for generations. The door to it was nothing special, just a wooden hatch in the ceiling at the end of the upstairs hallway, accessed by a fold-down ladder. It stayed closed most of the time, and honestly, I liked it that way. Then came the whispers. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed listening to the wind batter the house. It was a strong autumn storm, the kind that makes trees groan under the force of the gusts. The windows shuddered in their frames, and loose branches scraped against the siding. I had just started to doze off when something made me sit up. A noise. Soft, almost imperceptible at first. Whispers. They weren't clear words, just the faint murmur of voices like a conversation being held in another room. I blinked in the darkness, my ears straining to locate the sound. My first thought was that it had to be the wind slipping through some unseen gap in the attic. Old houses make noise. That's what I told myself. But as I sat there, heart hammering, I realized something. The whispers didn't rise and fall with the wind. They weren't part of the storm. They came in intervals, short bursts of hushed, hurried conversation, as though someone was speaking just out of reach. I forced myself to move, throwing off the blankets and stepping into the hallway. The attic hatch loomed above me, unmoving, closed tight. I stood there for a long moment, staring up at it, waiting for something to change. But the second I entered the hallway, the whispers stopped. I told myself I had imagined it. I was half asleep. The storm was loud and my mind had filled in the gaps. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The next morning, I checked the attic door. Locked, just as it had always been. I even pulled down the ladder and climbed up a few steps, pushing my head into the space above. The attic was still. Dust floated in the slanted sunlight filtering through a small, grimy window. Stacks of old trunks and furniture sat undisturbed, draped in faded sheets. Nothing. I tried to brush off the experience, but the unease lingered, and then a week later another storm rolled in, and the whispers came back. This time I was ready. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The voices were low, hurried, like someone urgently sharing a secret. They didn't come from the walls, the vents, or the floorboards. They were coming from the attic. I should have gotten up. I should have checked again, but I didn't. Instead, I lay frozen in bed, the hairs on my arms standing on end, listening as the whispers ebbed and flowed with the wind. And for the first time since moving into this house, I felt it. I wasn't alone. I tried to convince myself that the whispers were nothing, just air currents shifting through the attic, the wind pressing against the old wood in just the right way to create the illusion of sound. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Not really. Because the whispers didn't sound like the wind. They had rhythm, urgency, like voices speaking in hushed, hurried tones. And they always came during storms. The next few nights, I barely slept. Even when the weather was calm, I found myself lying awake, listening. My senses felt heightened, on edge. Every creak of the house made my pulse jump. Every slight shift in the air sent a shiver down my spine. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. One night, desperate for rest, I left the hallway light on. I figured if I could see the attic door clearly, if I kept reminding myself that it was locked, I'd feel safer. Maybe I'd even be able to sleep. It didn't help. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up with a start. No storm outside, no wind rattling the house, just silence, and then a whisper. I sat up, my body rigid. The sound was faint, but it was there. I turned my head toward the attic hatch. The hallway light cast a dim glow, and for a second I could almost convince myself that everything was normal. But then the whispering grew louder. Not much, just a fraction. Just enough to send ice through my veins. It was unmistakable. Someone, something, was up there. I threw off the covers, my breathing shallow, and stepped into the hallway. My feet were bare against the cold floor as I stared up at the attic door. It was still shut, locked, exactly how I had left it. I waited. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. But the second I turned to go back to bed, a soft rustling, a sound came from above me. I stopped mid-step, my heart pounding. It was subtle, like fabric brushing against wood. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it was enough to make my scalp prickle. I clenched my fists. "It's just a draft," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I didn't believe it. I forced myself back into bed, but I didn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every sound, losing sleep over something that might not even be real. So I did what any rational person would do. I checked the attic. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled down the ladder, and climbed up, my limbs tense with anticipation. The attic smelled of dust and age, the air stale and dry. My flashlight beam swept across the space, illuminating old furniture, trunks, and wooden beams covered in cobwebs. The floor was layered in dust, untouched. Nothing looked disturbed. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging slightly in the cool air. Maybe I had imagined the whispers after all. Then I checked for animal entry points. I searched every inch of the attic, corners, gaps between the rafters, even the insulation lining the walls. Nothing. No signs of rodents, no droppings, no nests, no claw marks. No reason for anything to be making noise up here. I swallowed, hard. I climbed back down, shut the attic door, and locked it again. That night the storm returned, and so did the whispers. But this time they were closer. I stopped sleeping altogether. The whispers came back with every storm, and now, even on clear nights, I felt it. That prickling sensation of being watched. The attic door loomed above, me like a sealed vault, holding something inside that I wasn't sure I wanted to face, but the worst part, I started seeing shadows. Not full-bodied figures, not ghostly apparitions, just fleeting, peripheral movement. Something shifting in the dimness of the hallway when I wasn't looking directly at it. A dark flicker in the corner of my eye, always near the attic door. The first time it happened, I was brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom. The door was open and I had a clear view of the hallway. As I looked down to rinse my mouth, something moved just outside the bathroom door. I jerked up, my heart hammering. Nothing, just the hallway, empty as ever. The attic hatch was closed, undisturbed. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on me, that I had been awake for too many nights, my mind fogged from lack of rest. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, just a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. Each time, closer to the attic. Desperate for answers, I started researching. I read about infrasound, low-frequency vibrations caused by wind, plumbing, even certain types of weather, that could cause feelings of unease, hallucinations, and the sensation of being watched. I read about air currents moving through old houses, creating soft noises that mimicked voices. That had to be it. It had to be. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew something didn't fit. If it was the wind, why did the whispers sound? Like speech, not random noise, not howling gusts, but voices? If it was just a draft, why did I only hear them in the attic? Why did they stop the second I stepped inside? A week later, I finally broke down and called an exterminator. If I couldn't find proof of animals in the attic, maybe a professional could. Maybe there was some entry point I had missed, some logical explanation I hadn't considered. He arrived early in the afternoon, a burly guy named Keith who looked like he had dealt with every pest problem imaginable. "You're hearing noises?" he asked, pulling a flashlight from his belt. "Yeah," I said. "Only when it's windy. It sounds like I don't know, movement. Maybe mice or birds." Keith nodded, pulling down the attic ladder. "Let's take a look." I stayed at the bottom as he climbed up, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Dust rained down as he moved, the attic creaking softly under his weight. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I shifted nervously on my feet. "Find anything?" Keith grunted. "Not a damn thing. No droppings, no nests, no tunnels. This attic's cleaner than most." I frowned. "So nothing's alive up there?" He chuckled. "Unless you got a ghost, I'd say no." He climbed back down, wiping dust from his hands. "You should check your insulation for gaps. Sometimes the wind can make weird noises in these old houses. That's my best guess." I forced a smile. "Yeah, that makes sense." But deep down, I knew better. That night, I left every light in the house on. But when the storm rolled in, the whispers returned. And this time they weren't just above me. They were in the hallway. I stopped going upstairs after dark. It wasn't just the attic anymore. The whispers had spread. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was so fixated on the sounds above me that I had started hearing things elsewhere. But as the wind howled outside and the house groaned under the weight of the storm, I knew the truth. The voices were getting closer. I sat in the living room, every lamp on, clutching my phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. The storm had picked up around midnight, rain lashing against the windows, the trees outside swaying like shadows in the wind. I tried to focus on the TV, on the rerun of some late-night sitcom, but I wasn't really watching. I was listening. Then it came. Not from the attic this time, from the hallway. A whisper. Soft, almost thoughtful, as if someone was speaking just under their breath. I froze, my body rigid. The coffee in my cup rippled as my hands trembled. Then another, a second whisper, overlapping the first like two voices speaking at once. I forced myself to breathe. This was just my imagination. It had to be. But then something moved. A shadow, just a flicker at the far end of the hallway. I jumped up, my pulse hammering, my eyes locked on the dark stretch of wood floor leading to the stairs. The attic door was shut, like always, but now it seemed different, more imposing, like something was waiting behind it. I swallowed hard. Hello? My voice came out weak, unsteady. The whispers stopped. The hallway stretched in front of me, empty. I took a slow step forward. My own reflection stared back at me from the hallway mirror, pale and uncertain. My feet made no sound on the wooden floor. Nothing moved. And yet the air felt charged, heavy, like I had walked into a room where a conversation had just ended. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back, a thud, loud, suddenly, from upstairs. I bolted. I ran back to the living room, slammed the door behind me, and pressed my back against it, my heart racing. My breath came in short gasps, my entire body shaking. I had heard that. That wasn't a trick of the wind. That wasn't my imagination. Something was in the house. Something was moving upstairs. And I didn't know if I was ready to find out what it was. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the living room, every light burning, my back pressed against the couch as I stared at the hallway. The TV was still on, playing some mindless infomercial, but I wasn't watching. My ears were trained on every sound, every shift in the air. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The wind had died down, the storm passing in the early hours before dawn, but the uneasy stillness lingered. I kept expecting to hear another thud, another whisper, but nothing came. That somehow made it worse. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to go upstairs. I had to see. My legs felt heavy as I forced myself up the steps, each creak underfoot making my stomach twist. The hallway stretched ahead, empty, the attic hatch looming above like a gaping mouth. For the first time, I noticed something odd: the dust. The floorboards upstairs had always had a fine layer of dust, a sign of a house that had been lived in but not frequently cleaned. But now a section near the attic ladder was disturbed. Something had moved there. Or someone. My breath hitched as I reached for the attic string, my fingers trembling. I pulled. The ladder creaked as it unfolded, the smell of dust and stale air wafting down. My flashlight flickers slightly as I pointed into the darkness above. I climbed. The attic was the same as before. Boxes stacked high, old furniture draped in sheets. But something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence thicker. I stepped forward cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across the space. Dust particles floated in the dim beam, swirling like tiny ghosts. Then I saw it. A mirror. A large antique mirror leaned against the far wall, its surface dull with age. I hadn't noticed it before. Not because it was hidden, but because it was facing the wall. Someone had deliberately turned it around. I swallowed, my throat dry. I stepped closer, my reflection barely visible in the dusty glass, and then a whisper, soft, right behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking. Nothing. Just the empty attic, the old trunks, the dust-covered furniture. My skin crawled. I turned back to the mirror, my breath shallow. And then, with a slow, hesitant movement, I reached out and touched the frame. The second my fingers brushed the wood, the whispering exploded. Rushed, urgent, overlapping voices filled the attic surrounding me. The air turned ice cold. My flashlight flickered wildly. Then, a reflection. But it wasn't mine. In the mirror, something moved. A shadow, no, a figure. A shape standing just behind me, dark and unmoving. I couldn't breathe. I turned, swinging the flashlight. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was closer. Not standing, crouching, watching. I don't remember running. I don't remember stumbling down the attic ladder, barely catching myself before I hit the floor. All I remember is bursting into the hallway, slamming the attic door shut and locking it. I packed a bag in under 5 minutes. I didn't care about breaking my lease. I didn't care about what was logical anymore. I just knew one thing. I was never staying in that house again. I left that day, found a new place, never looked back. A month later, I got a call from the landlord. He had sent someone to check the attic after I left. There were no animals, no broken insulation, no signs of a draft, but there was something else. The mirror. He said it had shattered, for no reason. Just broken, jagged shards scattered across the attic floor. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know, but sometimes, even now, when the wind howls through my new apartment, I still hear it. A whisper. Faint. Persistent. Like something searching for a way back. In the fall of 2007, I was broke, desperate, and in need of work. Savannah had always called to me. Something about its old-world charm, its cobbled streets and live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was a city with a memory, a place where the past never seemed too far away. I had moved there on a whim, hoping to find inspiration for my art, but the reality of paying rent had quickly overshadowed my creative ambitions. My paintings weren't selling, and my savings had run dry. After weeks of searching for work, I found myself at a small, dusty employment agency tucked between a voodoo supply shop and a pawn shop on a quiet side street. The sign on the door read, Madame Duval's Employment and Spiritual Consulting Services. I almost didn't go in. Something about it felt off, too theatrical, like a tourist trap pretending to be something real. But I had nothing to lose. Inside, the place smelled of lavender and something heavier, muskier. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange trinkets, old books, dried herbs, and what looked like bone charms tied with bits of red string. The air was thick, humming with the scent of candle wax and incense. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 60s, dark-skinned, her eyes sharp as flint. She wore a deep purple shawl draped over her shoulders, rings stacked on every finger. "You seek work," she said before I could speak. I hesitated. "Yeah. How did you—" She smiled. "I know many things." She gestured to the chair in front of her. "Sit, let's see where you belong." I wasn't sure if I was more intrigued or unnerved, but I sat down. She reached beneath her desk and pulled out a small, lacquered box, opening it with a soft click. Inside were a deck of cards, old and worn, the edges yellowed with time. She shuffled them once, then spread them out in a neat row. "Pick 3. I frowned. "I thought this was an employment agency." She smiled again, tapping the cards. "It is. Pick." I sighed and reached forward, pulling 3 cards at random. She turned them over, her expression unreadable. The Fool, the Tower, the Moon. Madame Duval studied them in silence, her fingers trailing over the illustrations. The Fool, new, beginnings, stepping into the unknown, she murmured. The Tower, disruption, chaos. And the Moon, her dark eyes flicked to mine. Deception, hidden things. A strange chill crawled up my spine. She gathered the cards and slid them back into the box. "I have a job for you," she said. "A place where you might find what you seek." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Where?" She reached into her desk and pulled out a small slip of paper, sliding it toward me. "The Savannah Tea Room," she said. "Ask for Evelyn." I frowned, glancing at the address. "Tea shop?" She nodded. "Yes, but it is more than that." She met my gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "Be careful what you stir up there, child." A second shiver ran through me. I didn't know what she meant then, but I would soon. The Savannah Tea Room sat on the edge of the historic district, tucked away between an old bookshop and a row of weathered townhouses. It was the kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance, its dark green awning slightly faded, the gold lettering on the window barely catching the light. The scent of jasmine and cinnamon drifted out from the entrance, mixing with the salty air rolling in from the river. I hesitated before going in. Madame Duval's warning lingered in my mind, but I chalked it up to theatrics. She made her living off mystery and mysticism, after all, and I needed the job. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The place was smaller than I expected, warm, dimly lit, with mismatched wooden tables and antique chairs. A long counter displayed glass jars filled with loose-leaf tea, each labeled in elegant handwriting. Earl Grey lavender, chamomile rose, dragon's breath chai. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding leather-bound volumes, vintage, tea sets, and tiny brass figurines. The scent of dried herbs and freshly baked scones filled the air, making the space feel cozy, almost timeless. A woman behind the counter looked up as I approached. She was in her early 40s with auburn hair twisted into a loose bun, her face framed by reading glasses. She had the air of someone who had seen everything and was rarely surprised by anything. "You must be the one Madame Duval sent," she said, giving me a once-over. I nodded. "Yeah," she said to ask for Evelyn. She wiped her hands on a linen towel and extended one toward me. "That's me. Welcome to the tea room." Her grip was firm, her skin cool. I glanced around. "So, what exactly would I be doing here?" She smirked. "That depends. We do more than just serve tea. Some people come for the drinks and pastries. Others come for—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Guidance." "Guidance?" "Readings, tarot, palmistry, divination. Some just need a quiet place to think." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just nodded. "So, what's my job?" She handed me a small apron from a hook by the counter. Serving tea, keeping the place tidy, learning the menu. Nothing too complicated. Relief washed over me. This was just another cafe job, no different from the ones I'd worked before. Maybe Madame Duval had been overly dramatic. Then I met Celeste. Celeste was the tea room's tarot reader. She was young, probably around my age, with striking, dark eyes and an energy that felt both warm and restless, like she was always teetering on the edge of something unseen. Her hands were adorned with silver rings, her long fingers constantly fidgeting with the delicate chain around her neck. The locket. I noticed it the first time we met. A small, intricately designed silver pendant that she never took off. She caught me looking at it and gave a small, tight smile. "It belonged to someone important," she said simply. I nodded, not wanting to pry. But something about the way she touched it, the way her fingers absently traced its shape whenever she wasn't thinking about it, made me curious. Over the next few days, I settled into the routine. The job was easy enough: brewing tea, clearing tables, keeping the old cash register from jamming. Celeste and I became fast friends, bonded by long shifts and whispered jokes behind the counter. But I quickly learned that she wasn't as carefree as she seemed. At times, I would catch her staring off into space, her face drawn, her fingers gripping that locket so tightly her knuckles turned white. Once I walked into the back room and found her hunched over her tarot cards, whispering under her breath, her eyes flicking back and forth as if she were arguing with someone who wasn't there. I asked her if she was okay. She forced a smile. "Just tired." I didn't push, but something about her felt unsettled. And then, one night, I heard her crying. It was just after closing. Evelyn had left early, and I was wiping down the tables while Celeste sat at her usual corner, shuffling her deck absent-mindedly. The tea room was quiet. The only sound was the gentle clink of china being put away. Then, without warning, Celeste gasped. I turned to see her staring at a single card she had drawn, the Tower. Her hands trembled as she exhaled sharply. "Not again." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She shook her head. "Nothing. Just bad luck." But she was lying. Later that night, as I was stacking chairs, I heard it. A soft, heart-wrenching sob coming from the back room where Celeste kept her things. I hesitated, then knocked gently. "Celeste?" Silence, then barely above a whisper. "Go home." I shivered. Something was very wrong with Celeste, and I was about to find out just how deep it ran. I should have listened to Celeste that night. I should have gone home. But something about the way her voice had sounded, small, distant, almost hollow, lingered in my mind long after I left the tea room. It wasn't just sadness. It was fear. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was in trouble. The next morning, when I walked into the shop, she was already there, sitting at her usual table by the window. A deck of tarot cards lay in front of her, but she wasn't shuffling them like she usually did. She was just staring at them, her fingers resting lightly on the top card, as if afraid to flip it over. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She blinked, then looked up at me with tired eyes. "You could say that." I hesitated. "Celeste, are you okay?" She let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's a complicated question." I sat across from her. "Try me." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's this damn locket," she muttered. "And these cards." I glanced at the silver pendant hanging around her neck. "What about them?" She hesitated, then slid the locket back and forth along the chain, her eyes distant. "I think something is attached to me," she admitted, "and I think it has been for a long time." A chill crept up my spine. "Attached?" She nodded. "I started having dreams when I was a kid. Strange ones. A man in a military uniform, standing in a field of fog. At first he just watched me. Then, as I got older, he started whispering things. I could never understand him, but it always felt like a warning." I swallowed. "And the locket?" "It belonged to someone from a past life, at least that's what I was told." She let out a breath. "I've been carrying it ever since, but lately, I think whatever was in those dreams is getting stronger." She tapped the tarot deck lightly. "It's been showing up in the cards, too." I stared at the deck. "Like, what happened last night?" Celeste nodded. "The tower. It's never a good sign. I didn't know much about tarot, but I knew enough to understand that the tower symbolized upheaval, destruction, something collapsing in on itself. Maybe it's just a coincidence," I offered. She gave me a look. "You don't believe that." I didn't. Not after everything I had seen in that place. The way shadows stretched too far, the way the air always felt thicker when the storms rolled in. Celeste exhaled slowly, then reached for the deck. "Here, let me read for you." I hesitated. "I don't. It might help," she said. "Maybe it'll show us something useful." I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but I nodded anyway. She shuffled the deck with practiced ease, then set 3 cards on the table, face down. Her fingers hovered over the first one. The second she flipped it, the air in the room shifted. It was the tower. Again. Celeste sucked in a sharp breath. "No." I swallowed hard. "What?" She flipped the second card. Death. My stomach clenched. The third card. The devil. The air around us dropped, the temperature plummeting so fast my breath came out in a visible cloud. The tea service tray on the counter rattled, the china cups trembling. Celeste's hands went ice cold. And then, a whisper. Right behind me. I turned sharply, my heart slamming in my chest. Nothing. But for the briefest moment, I saw it. In the reflection of the tea tray's polished surface, a man. Tall, dressed in a faded military uniform, his face half hidden in shadow, watching. Then, as fast as he had appeared, he was gone. Celeste let out a ragged breath, her fingers white-knuckled, around the locket. "It's getting worse." I didn't argue, because I knew she was right, the moment those 3 cards were revealed. The tower, death, the devil. Something shifted in the air. I felt it in my chest first, like the pressure of a storm rolling in, thick and suffocating. Celeste's hands trembled as she gathered the cards, shuffling them back into the deck with jerky, uneven movements. "This isn't right," she muttered. "It's not supposed to happen like this." I swallowed hard. "What does it mean?" She shook her head, looking more shaken than I'd ever seen her. "It's not just a warning, it's an invitation." "An invitation for what?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the locket at her throat. Then she looked past me toward the hallway that led to the back room. Her face went pale, and that's when I heard it. A soft, muffled sob. Low, childlike. Coming from the back room where Celeste kept her tarot supplies, candles, and books. I turned sharply, my stomach dropping. The tea room was empty except for the two of us. The doors were locked. No customers had been in for at least an hour. Celeste stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "No," she whispered. "Not now." I forced myself to speak. "Who's back there?" She didn't answer. Instead, she rushed toward the hallway, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I hesitated for half a second before following her. The sobbing continued, soft, uneven, like someone struggling to breathe between gasps of fear. Celeste reached the back room first. The door was ajar, swinging lightly on its hinges as if someone had just passed through. She hesitated only a second before pushing it open. I braced myself. The room was freezing, the kind of cold that shouldn't have existed on a humid Savannah afternoon. Candles lined the shelves, their wicks blackened but unlit. A small wooden table sat in the center of the room, tarot cards scattered across its surface. And in the farthest corner, where the shadows were thickest, a shape, small, hunched. The sobbing grew louder, curling into my bones. Celeste took a shaky step forward. "Who's there?" The shape moved, just the slightest shift. My breath hitched. My gut screamed at me to run. Then the sobbing stopped. A pause. Too long. And then a whisper, soft and fractured. "Help me." I grabbed Celeste's arm, yanking her backward. "We're leaving." She resisted. "Wait, The table shook violently. Tarot cards flew into the air, scattering like dead leaves. Celeste let out a sharp cry, stumbling against me as the air crackled with something unseen. The overhead light flickered. The candles lining the shelves burst into flame all at once. And in the polished reflection of the tea tray sitting on the table, that same figure. The man in the faded military uniform, standing behind us. His face was clearer this time. Sharp cheekbones, hollowed eyes, a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His lips moved, forming silent words that I couldn't hear. Celeste let out a choked sound, her hand flying to the locket at her throat. "No," she whispered. "You're not real." The man's reflection tilted its head, and then, in a voice that wasn't just an echo, wasn't just a whisper carried by the wind, he spoke. "You know me." I didn't think. I grabbed Celeste by the wrist and ran. We didn't stop until we were out the front door, gasping for breath, the hot Savannah air hitting us like a slap to the face. Celeste clutched at her locket, her face pale as death. "It's him," she whispered. I swallowed, my mouth dry. "Who?" She finally looked at me, and in her wide, terrified eyes I saw the truth before she even spoke the words. "The man from my dreams." Celeste and I didn't go back inside the tea room for a long time. We stood on the sidewalk, the humid, Savannah air pressing against our skin, but the cold from the back room still clung to me. It was deep, unnatural, like it had settled into my bones. Celeste's fingers were locked around the silver locket, her knuckles white. She was shaking, her breath uneven. I swallowed, trying to steady my own nerves. "Who was that?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know." But I could tell she was lying. The street around us was quiet. It was past closing time, and the only sounds were the distant hum of passing cars and the rustling of trees in the warm breeze. The tea room stood behind us, dark and silent now, but I could feel it. Something was still watching. Celeste finally moved, exhaling shakily. "We can't leave it like this." I turned to her, incredulous. "You want to go back inside?" She nodded, though she didn't look convinced of her own decision. "I need to know why he's here, why he's attached to me." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed to walk away, to never step foot inside that building again. But Celeste was my friend, and somehow, I knew if we didn't face this now, it wouldn't stop. The final confrontation. The door creaked as we stepped back, into the tea room. The air inside felt wrong, thicker, charged with something unseen. The scent of tea and herbs had been swallowed by something colder, more metallic. We moved slowly toward the back room. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and impossibly silent. The candles that had burst into flames earlier were now out. There, wax pooled in hardened rivers down the shelves. The tarot cards still lay scattered across the floor, and the mirror, the silver tea tray that had reflected him, sat on the table, its surface dull. Celeste swallowed hard. "I need to know what he wants." Before I could stop her, she stepped forward, standing directly in front of the tea tray's reflection. I held my breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft tap. From inside, the mirror. Celeste flinched but didn't step back. Her grip on the locket tightened. The silver tray shuddered, the reflection inside rippling like water. And then, the man appeared again. Only this time. He wasn't just watching. He was staring directly at her. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His expression was unreadable, something between sorrow and anger. And then slowly he raised his hand. His fingers curled into a fist, except for one. He was pointing at the locket. Celeste gasped, her hand flying away from it like it had burned her. "No," she whispered. "It's mine." I didn't understand. "Celeste, what's happening?" She turned to me, eyes wide. "He wants it back." The mirror trembled violently. The reflection warped, and the man's features became sharper, his uniform clearer now. An old Confederate coat, buttons tarnished, fabric worn with time. His scarred face twisted, and this time when his mouth moved, the words came through, "Give it back." The walls around us groaned. The candles on the shelves flickered back to life on their own. Celeste was shaking. I grabbed her wrist. "Give him the locket." Her eyes filled with something wild, something torn between fear and possession. "I can't." "Yes, you can," I said. "It's not yours, Celeste. It never was." Tears welled in her eyes, but she knew I was right. With trembling hands, she unclasped the silver locket from her neck. The moment it left her skin, the air in the room shifted. The pressure that had been bearing down on us lifted just slightly. She hesitated, looking at the mirror, at the man still watching her from inside. Then, slowly, she placed the locket onto the tray. The second the silver touched the surface, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, but no shards hit us. It was as if the pieces had vanished mid-air, leaving nothing but the empty tray behind. The candles blew out. The heavy air lifted completely. And just like that, he was gone. The aftermath. Celeste never spoke much about what happened that night. She didn't tell me where the locket had come from or who the man was. But I think I knew. It had belonged to him, and for years, maybe lifetimes, he had been searching for it, for her. After that night, the tea room felt different, warmer, lighter. The feeling of being watched was gone. Celeste left a month later. She said she needed to get out of Savannah, that she needed space to clear her mind. I didn't argue. I still work at the tea room sometimes. The tarot deck still sits behind the counter untouched. The silver tea tray is still there, now slightly tarnished, but its surface is empty. And yet, on stormy nights when the wind howls through the streets, I swear, just for a second, I still hear the faintest sound of a whisper. Not angry, not demanding, just grateful. I never thought of myself as superstitious. Ghost stories were for people who needed excitement in their lives, a way to make the mundane feel significant. I wasn't one of those people. I was practical, logical, and yet, standing in the dimly lit hallway of my rented home, watching the mirror's reflection shift ever so slightly, I felt something I hadn't in years. Fear. I moved into the old mill house 3 months ago. The place had history. Built in the late 1800s, once part of a working mill, then converted into separate residences in the 1970s. My unit was a section of the original house, complete with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and thick stone walls that muffled sound almost too well. It was charming in a way that felt authentic, untouched by the modern world. At first it was peaceful. The town was small, quiet, the kind of place where people still waved at each other from their porches. I spent my evenings sketching by the large front window, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. But then, the incidents began. The first time I saw it, I was walking past the hallway mirror at dusk, a fleeting, indistinct shape, something barely there but enough to make me pause. I turned quickly, but nothing was behind me, just the long, empty corridor leading to the staircase. It's just the light, I muttered to myself. The house was old and mirrors played tricks in low light, but then it happened again and again. Even with the hallway light on, I would catch the shape in my peripheral vision, something low to the ground shifting just out of sight. Then came the cold. It wasn't like the usual drafts I had come to expect from old houses. It was sharp, deliberate, as if someone was standing just beside me, exhaling frozen air against my skin. I checked the windows. Closed. No vents. No explanation. The first time I woke up at 2 a.m., I didn't think much of it. Everyone wakes up in the middle of the night now and then. But when it became a pattern, every night without fail, my eyes snapping open to a still, heavy silence, I couldn't ignore it. And then, one night I saw it. The shape. Not just in the mirror. Not just in the corner of my eye, but moving, gliding, down the hallway toward the staircase. It was dark, low to the ground, and its movements were unnatural, almost like it was crawling. I sat up, my heart hammering so hard it felt like my ribs might crack. The air in the room had changed, thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. I wanted to turn on the light to break the illusion, but I couldn't move. And then came the sound, a rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate, like a gentle knocking from inside the walls. It started in the hallway, then moved closer. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped the edge of my blanket, swallowing hard. The house was settling. That's what the neighbors would say. That's what I wanted to believe. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. It was exhaustion, stress, nothing more. But the feeling didn't fade. I started leaving more lights on, keeping the TV or music playing just to fill the silence. But nothing drowned out the sensation of being watched. A week passed, and then something new happened. My sketchbook, the one I always kept by my bed, was in the living room, face down in the center of the floor. I frowned, picking it up. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. But no, I never brought it into the living room. Ever. And then, little things began to disappear. My necklace, a small silver pendant my mother had given me, turned up in the pantry. My hairbrush, one I always kept on my dresser, was shoved beneath the sofa cushions. I searched for logical explanations. Maybe I was absent-minded, misplacing things. Maybe I was developing a sleep disorder. But the harder I tried to reason, the more absurd it seemed. One evening I sat on the couch, turning my necklace over, in my fingers, staring at the hallway mirror. I had stopped looking directly at it. Whatever I kept seeing, I didn't want to see it again. Out loud I said, "If there's something here, Let me know. Silence. I sighed, shaking my head. I was losing it. Then, scrack. A long, slow, scratching sound. I shot to my feet, heart slamming against my ribs. It came from beneath the floorboards. I stood frozen, my breath shaky. And then I saw it. On the kitchen counter, a key, small, rusted antique. I had never seen it before. It hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. I swallowed hard, staring at the tiny object. My fingers itched to pick it up, but something inside me screamed not to. That night, I hardly slept. In the morning, I knocked on my neighbor's door. Mrs. Avery, an elderly woman who had lived in town all her life, greeted me with a warm but puzzled smile. "The old mill house?" she said, shaking her head. "Oh dear, that house has always had its quirks. It's just settling, I'm sure." But when I mentioned the mirror, her smile faltered. She hesitated. "You should leave that alone, dear." I frowned. "Leave what alone?" Mrs. Avery pursed her lips. "Some things, they don't like being noticed." A chill ran down my spine. That night I placed a voice recorder in the hallway, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The next morning I listened back. At first, it was just the quiet hum of the house, my own footsteps, the distant sound of wind. Then around 2 a.m., a whisper, faint, distorted, a single word. "Stay." I dropped the recorder. My hands were shaking. Something was here, and it didn't want me to leave. I stared at the recorder, my pulse thundering in my ears. Stay. It was barely more than a breath, distorted and distant, but I had heard it. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house, every shift in the wind outside, felt like a warning. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Sound distortion, my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. The key was still on the kitchen counter. I hadn't touched it, couldn't bring myself to, but it sat there, like it was waiting for me. By morning, exhaustion had turned my nerves raw. I needed answers. If I couldn't trust my own senses, maybe I could trust the history of this place. I drove into town and headed to the library. It was a small, quiet building, the kind of place that smelled like old books and dust. The town's historical records were kept in the basement, and after some convincing, the librarian let me dig through the old files. The old mill house had a long history. It was originally built as part of a textile mill in the late 1800s, housing workers and their families. Over time, the mill closed and the house changed hands multiple times. Then I found it. A newspaper clipping from 1912. Mysterious disappearance at the old mill house. Local boy missing. I skimmed the article, my hands trembling. A young James Whitmore, age 9, had vanished without a trace. His parents had searched for days, but the only clue left behind was an open door leading to the basement. His body was never found. For years, rumors spread that he had fallen into the old mill's underground tunnels, but no one could confirm it. The house was renovated, the basement sealed. I stared at the faded photograph of the boy, dark eyes, a solemn expression. And then I remembered. The shape, low to the ground, the scratching beneath the floorboards. I felt cold all over. I needed to get out of there. That night I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the key. I had spent the day convincing myself it was a coincidence. Just an old story. Just an abandoned basement that had nothing to do with me. But my gut told me otherwise. The key was small, rusted, with an ornate handle. It didn't look like it belonged to anything modern. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, cool to the touch. I swallowed hard, gripping it tightly, and then the lights flickered. The temperature in the room dropped, and I heard it. A soft rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the floor. I held my breath, my grip tightening around the key. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then silence, a single breath, close, right behind me. "Stay!" I spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing, just the dim glow of the hallway lamp, the reflection in the mirror catching my pale, terrified face. I was done. Tomorrow, I was calling a locksmith. Tomorrow, I was getting the hell out of this house. But deep down, I already knew the house wasn't done with me yet. I called Lena the next morning. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, concern thick in her voice. I hesitated, fingers tightening around my coffee mug. "I just, need you to stay over for a few nights, just to see if you notice anything." She agreed, though I could tell she thought I was overreacting. By the time she arrived, I had already arranged for a locksmith to come by in the morning. The key was still in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder that something in this house wasn't right. Lena rolled her suitcase into the living room, glancing around. "It looks normal enough, cozy even." I forced a smile. "Yeah, it does." That night, we stayed up watching movies, talking about everything except the house. I wanted her to relax, to feel like nothing was wrong, but my nerves were shot. Every time I glanced at the mirror, I half expected to see that shape again. Midnight came and went. By 2 a.m., I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Lena slept soundly on the couch. Then, tap. I sat up, heart pounding. Tap, tap. It was coming from the floor. I turned my head slowly, barely breathing. Lena shifted in her sleep, but she didn't wake up. Then I heard it. The sound of something moving. A slow, scraping noise, like fingernails against wood. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The sound stopped. For a long moment, I sat there listening to the silence. Then I stood up. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that I had to know. I walked to the kitchen, pulled the key from my pocket, and knelt down near the floorboards. I ran my fingers along the edges, pressing lightly. And then, one of the boards shifted. I inhaled sharply. A loose floorboard. With shaking hands, I pried it up. Beneath it, the darkness yawned wide and endless. A small hidden space. And, inside it, a doorway. Not a modern one. An old, narrow opening carved into the foundation. A passage leading downward. I stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs. The knocking, the voices, the key. It wasn't just an old story. James Whitmore never left this house. And whatever was down there, it was waiting. Morning came too slowly. I hadn't slept. I had placed the floorboard back in place, covering the hidden passage like a wound hastily stitched shut. Lena stirred, on the couch stretching. "Morning," she mumbled. "Did you sleep at all?" I shook my head. She frowned, sitting up. "Anya, I think you need to—" A sharp bang interrupted her. We both jumped. It came from the kitchen, from beneath the floor. Lena's eyes widened. "What the hell was that?" I swallowed hard. "I need to show you something." She followed me as I knelt by the floorboards and hesitated. Then, carefully, I lifted the board again. The passage gaped beneath us. The air that rose from it was stale, thick with something old and heavy. Lena covered her mouth. "What is that?" I didn't answer, because down there in the dark something moved. A shape, small, watching. Lena gasped, stumbling back. The whisper came again, rising from the passage like breath from a forgotten grave. "Stay." The key slipped from my fingers, clattering against the wood. And the last thing I saw before we ran, before we slammed the floorboard shut and fled, from that cursed house was the reflection in the mirror. A boy, pale, wide-eyed, smiling, waiting. I left the old mill house that week, paid the penalty, broke my lease, and never looked back. Lena never questioned my decision. I never spoke about what we saw. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking. Faint, persistent, like something searching for a way out. I had never heard of Uncle Raymond until I inherited his house. The call came from a lawyer in Boston, a sharp-voiced woman named Ms. Greeley, who informed me that my great-uncle, someone I had never met, never even known existed, had passed away and left me his estate. It felt like a mistake, some mix-up in paperwork, but she assured me it was real. The house, the land, everything now belonged to me. With one condition. I had to live there for a full year. I hesitated at first. The idea of uprooting my life for a place I had no connection to seemed ridiculous. But I didn't have much of a life to uproot. My job was remote. My apartment was small and overpriced, and I had no family left who would miss me. Maybe this was a chance for something new. Or maybe, as I would later realize, it was a terrible mistake. The mansion sat on the edge of a small New England town, its iron gate rusted from years of neglect. The driveway was long and cracked, leading up to an estate that looked like something pulled from the pages of a Gothic novel. The house was 3 stories tall, its dark stone exterior covered in ivy, its massive windows clouded with dust. The front porch sagged slightly, the wooden boards worn with time. Inside, the air smelled of old books and something faintly metallic. The grand entryway was lined with dark wood paneling, and a chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by age. A long staircase led to the upper floors, its banister carved with intricate patterns. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you aware of every breath, every step. I wandered through the first floor, taking in the parlor, the dining room, the library filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Dust coated everything, but underneath it the house still held onto its former grandeur. Then I started noticing the mirrors. They were everywhere, not just in the expected places like bathrooms and bedrooms, but in hallways, stairwells, even inside closets. Massive, gleaming mirrors that looked completely untouched. No dust, no grime. Some were ornate, framed in gold or silver, while others were simple, their glass stretching from floor to ceiling. It was unsettling. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. I found the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. Its 4-poster bed still made as if someone had been expecting me. A large mirror faced the bed, its surface catching the dim glow of the hallway light. As I climbed into bed, a strange unease settled in my chest. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the size of the house, the weight of knowing I was alone here. But as I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard a door creak open. And in the morning, I found my bedroom door standing wide open. I sat up so fast my head spun. The bedroom door was open, yawning into the dimly lit hallway. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold wood floor biting against my feet. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I strained to hear any sound. Footsteps, movement, breathing. But the house was silent. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady, and stepped toward the door. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with more of those massive, spotless mirrors, their glass reflecting my hesitant movements. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly. Maybe an old house like this had drafts that could pull it open. Then I saw the footprints, faint, almost imperceptible against the dark wooden floorboards. They led from the doorway into the hall, bare footprints, slightly smudged, as if whoever had left them had been walking slowly, cautiously. My breath caught in my throat. I checked. The locks on the front and back doors, secure. The windows were shut tight. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, except for my door and those footprints. I spent the morning trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house felt different now, its silence less peaceful and more expectant, as if it was waiting for me to acknowledge something. The mirrors didn't help. As I moved through the house, I became hyper-aware of them. They were always there, reflecting me from different angles, making the space feel distorted. I would catch glimpses of myself in the corner of my eye and flinch, my own reflection feeling unfamiliar. Some were positioned in ways that didn't make sense. One at the end of a hallway, another directly across from the dining room table, a particularly large one leaning against the wall inside a closet. By midday, I felt exhausted, drained by the growing unease pressing down on me. I decided to distract myself with something productive and spent the afternoon clearing out the parlor. The house was filled with furniture covered in dust sheets, old trunks and books that hadn't been touched in decades. As I pulled one of the dust sheets away, I felt a sudden shift in the air behind me, a whisper of movement. I turned so quickly I nearly knocked over a side table. Nothing. Just my reflection in the large mirror across the room. I exhaled shakily, rubbing my arms to chase away the sudden chill. I needed fresh air. Stepping outside, I took deep breaths, trying to ground myself. The overgrown grounds stretched before me, the trees swaying gently in the afternoon light. The mansion loomed behind me, its windows catching the sun, the mirrors inside reflecting light in strange, fractured patterns. For the first time since I had arrived, I had the distinct feeling that the house was aware of me, and that it had been waiting. I stayed outside longer than I intended, letting the damp earth and crisp air settle my nerves. The house stood behind me, massive and still, its windows dark despite the sunlight filtering through the trees. I kept glancing at them, half expecting to see movement inside. By the time I went back in, the late afternoon light was slanting through the tall windows, casting long shadows along the floors. The house was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, thick and unmoving. I tried to ignore it, forcing myself back into a routine, making dinner, flipping through an old book I had found in the study. But I couldn't ignore the mirrors. I kept catching glimpses of them, reflections shifting slightly, as I moved from room to room. The way they were positioned made it impossible to avoid them completely. Every time I turned a corner, my reflection greeted me from another angle. As night fell, I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would help push away the unease, gnawing at my stomach. I locked my bedroom door, double-checked it this time, then climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chest. I barely remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. Something had pulled me from my dreams. A sound, faint and distant. I lay still, listening. The house creaked softly, as old houses do, settling against the night air. But there was something else. A light sound, barely audible, like fabric brushing against wood. Footsteps. My body tensed, my breath held tight in my chest. The noise wasn't coming from inside my room. It was just outside my door, moving slowly down the hallway. Soft, barefoot. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but the moment my fingers wrapped around it, the sound stopped. Silence. I stayed, frozen, staring at the door, willing myself to breathe. A full minute passed, then another. My heartbeat slowed slightly and I let out a quiet exhale. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the house was playing tricks on me. Then from the other side of the door, the knob twisted. A sharp, distinct click as it turned against the lock. I shot upright, my breath catching in my throat. I had locked it. I knew I had. The knob rattled slightly, then went still. I waited, every muscle locked in place, listening for movement. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally forced myself out of bed, my legs unsteady. I approached the door slowly, pressing my ear against the wood. The hallway was silent. I reached for the knob and turned it just enough to check. The lock. Still secure. Swallowing hard, I stepped back and glanced toward the large mirror across from my bed. My own reflection stared back at me, my face pale in the dim light, but something was wrong. The door behind me in the reflection was wide open. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The door was still closed, locked. I stared at it for several long seconds, willing my brain to catch up, to make sense of what I had just seen. The reflection had been wrong, but how? How could a mirror show something that wasn't real? I turned back slowly, my eyes locking onto the mirror. My reflection looked the same, wide-eyed, tense, standing in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The door behind me was still shut, but the longer I stared, the more an unease settled deep in my stomach. Something felt off. The room in the mirror looked just a shade darker, the air in the reflection heavier. The bed was slightly unmade in a way mine wasn't. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched just a little too far. And then, in the reflection, the door handle twisted. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my throat. My real door didn't move, but in the mirror I watched as the handle slowly turned, the door creaking open inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Then a bare footprint appeared on the floor inside the reflected room. My stomach lurched. The footprint was wet, as if someone had just stepped inside from a storm. Another one followed, then another. A trail moving toward the bed. I slammed my hand against the nightstand, fumbling for the lamp's switch. The bright light flooded the room, chasing away the dim, suffocating darkness. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection was normal again. The door in the mirror was shut. The footprints were gone. The bed looked exactly the way I had left it. My own reflection stared back, pale and shaken, but otherwise unchanged. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the edge of the nightstand to steady myself. My mind was racing, searching for logic, for a reason. I was sleep-deprived, rattled from being alone in this house. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my brain had taken the stress, the exhaustion, and twisted it into something surreal. I turned back to the door, unlocking it with shaking hands. I had to see the hallway. I had to prove to myself that nothing was there. I cracked the door open and peered outside. The hallway was still. The long stretch of wood and mirrors bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing moved. No footprints. No open doors. Just the stillness of the house pressing in from all sides. But something had changed. One of the mirrors, just across from my door, was different now. A streak of condensation ran down the glass, as if someone had been standing right in front of it, breathing. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slowly, dragging itself over the horizon like it didn't want to touch this house. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, the lock still latched tight. The memory of the mirror's reflection lingered in my mind, the wet footprints, the door creaking open into darkness. I told myself that exhaustion was messing with me, that my brain was twisting the shadows into something they weren't, but I knew better. I forced myself to stand, my legs stiff from staying in one position for too long. The floor was cold under my bare feet as I walked to the door. My fingers hesitated on the lock before I took a deep breath and turned it. The hallway stretched ahead, unchanged. The same heavy mirrors lined the walls, their glass reflecting the dim morning light filtering through the windows. But I barely noticed them because my focus went straight to the mirror across from my door. The condensation was still there. A streak of moisture, fresh, untouched, as if someone had only just stepped away. My stomach twisted. I reached out, pressing my fingertips against the glass. It was cold, too cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer overnight. I pulled my hand back quickly, the uneasy weight in my chest growing heavier. I needed to get out of this house. I moved quickly, grabbing my bag from the bedroom and throwing in the few things I had unpacked. I didn't care about staying the full year anymore. Whatever inheritance was tied to this place, it wasn't worth it. As I passed through the halls, I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to glance at the mirrors. I could feel them, though, the weight of reflections that weren't quite right pressing against my skin. The urge to look was unbearable, but I didn't give in. I reached the grand staircase and took the steps two at a time. The house groaned around me, like it knew I was leaving, like it wasn't ready to let me go. At the front door, I grabbed, the handle twisting hard. It wouldn't budge. My breath hitched. I twisted it again, harder this time, yanking at the heavy wood. It was locked, but not in a way that made sense, like something on the other side was holding it closed. I took a step back, panic clawing at my throat. My eyes darted to the large mirror in the entryway, and I saw it. A figure, standing on the staircase behind me. Tall, thin, its skin pale and stretched too tightly over its bones. Its face was wrong, like a smudged reflection trying to mold itself into something human, but failing. Its head tilted, slightly, watching me. Its lips moved, but no sound came out. I didn't think. I turned and ran, tearing through the house, my feet barely touching the floor as I sprinted for the back door. This one opened. Cold air rushed in as I stumbled, outside, nearly tripping over the uneven stone path leading away from the house. I didn't stop, didn't turn back. I ran through the overgrown grass, past the rusted gate, onto the dirt road that led away from the estate. I didn't look at the windows. I didn't check to see if the figure was following me. I just ran. I never went back. I didn't call the lawyer. I didn't try to claim the house. I didn't care what happened to it. Months later, I got a letter from Ms. Greeley's office, a formal notice. Since I had failed to meet the conditions of the inheritance, the estate would be passed to another distant relative. I didn't open the rest of the letter. I didn't need to know. But sometimes late at night I think about the mirrors, and I wonder if the next person will know not to look.